what works, what doesn't work. There are many politicians who talk about smashing the supply chains of the criminal gangs. You know, the Labour Party is big into this. The Conservatives have recently done a deal with the Turkish government. You know, there's an academy over there. There's more cooperation with the Germans and so on. Listen, this will make some difference at the margins, but ultimately it's like whack-a-mole. You know, if you close down one factory or one gang, another one pops up again. The key is making it economically irrational for people to cross the channel. Can Rwanda work? Yeah, absolutely. But you have to deport a critical mass of people. If you don't do that, it's not going to work. There are other ways of...
How many would a critical mass be?
It would have to be in the thousands. So
many thousands, really, wouldn't it?
Yeah. If it's a few hundred, the sort of cost-benefit analysis from the migrants' perspective is you know, they may be tempted. Well, it might actually be worth paying that €4,000 to cross the channel. So it's all about incentives and disincentives. Of course, there are other ways of doing this. You could amend the Human Rights Act, which is the nuclear option, and you know, obviously the government are not keen to do that. They want to circumnavigate the system through the Rwanda bill, sort of disapplying parts of the Human Rights Act rather than actually amending it. For whatever reason, it's very difficult for them to go to the root cause, but that's another option. In terms of safe and legal routes, there's much talk of this, but the thing is, it's already been tried. President Biden has done this in the US. He's got a bilateral agreement with the Mexican government. The Mexicans have agreed to take people back who are there illegally in the US, and in return, Biden is taking, you know, refugees from Latin America. What happened? Real-world example, right? The figures initially plateaued, and people were like, "Great, this is working." A few months later, the numbers spiked. So it's actually just increased the numbers and increased the pull factor. That's the reality. Look at what happens in the real world. There's a danger of paralysis through analysis here and being too theoretical about it. Look at what's happened, look at what's worked, look at what hasn't worked. And it's clear safe and legal routes don't work.
Dr. Jones, you just talked about root causes, and as you said it, I thought, yes, that is actually the key. I mean, we've got, according to the UNHCR, Simon will correct me as he once did on a previous occasion about the numbers, but I read recently, but it's about 110 million people who are displaced in the world at the moment. Yeah. And thinking about that, it takes us back to what Mr. Solomon was saying, really, about where we've been before. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, the last time we had such a huge number of people displaced and having to both accommodate but rebuild their lives, and the international community stepped up, and everything from Bretton Woods to the Marshall Aid Programme to the creation of the Iron and Steel Community and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 75 years ago, and the Refugee Convention in 1951. Winston Churchill took us into those treaties, those conventions, because he said the world has to step up to the plate. We have to be part of the solution. And it imposes upon us collective responsibilities. And I want to ask you first, if I may, and then I'll ask you about the convention duties, because our mandate as a committee is particularly to look at our obligations under the ECHR. But first of all, under the 1951 Convention on Refugees and the need for us to act collectively, what effect will this have on those obligations, this bill? What effect will it have? Will it be negative? Is it possible to comply with those obligations or not?
Well, both the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court said there's nothing incompatible with the Geneva Convention in returning somebody to a safe third country. So obviously the question isn't, is this compatible with the Geneva Convention? Is Rwanda a safe country? In terms of international conventions and humanitarian obligations, you've got to remember many of these conventions and treaties were created, you know, in the aftermath of the Second World War and during the Cold War, and these treaties were aimed at much smaller groups of people. They were aimed, obviously, at refugees from Nazi Germany. They were aimed at refugees from the Soviet Union and the various satellite states. So many of the issues we have now, you know, global communications, you know, aviation that's accessible to everyone, you know, really quick transport, and people on the move constantly, that wasn't anticipated by the people who drafted the legislation. So, non-refoulement was aimed at refugees from behind the Iron Curtain, because if they were sent back, they'd be detained, interrogated, they'd have a confession taken out of them, and they'd either end up dead or in a gulag. So these laws were created for a very different time and place, and the key question is, are they compatible with the world we now live in post the Cold War?
Well, not just the world, but our duties.